You gave up everything to do the right thing, and they still called you a disgrace. But what hurts more than betrayal is silence from those who should have stood beside you. And yet, the loudest revenge is being recognized by the very power they worship, while they're forced to watch. They didn't save me a seat. Not at the table. Not in the photos. Not in the story they told the world about who we were. I flew across 2 states for my father's military honors dinner. Wore a navy blue blazer, the same one he bought me before I left for Washington. I brought the commendation letter I wrote for him, signed by the senator herself. They never read it. Instead, they handed the microphone to my younger brother. Gave him the stage. Toasted to his future in national defense, like I never worked a single policy hour in my life. And I sat there. Clapping politely, smiling like a ghost, because what else do you do when your own family acts like you died the moment you stopped doing what they expected? No one mentioned my years overseas. No one asked where I'd been. Not even my mother. She just said, "We don't talk about that mess anymore," like I was the scandal, not the sacrifice. But then, a month later, at a governor's gala, something cracked. He saw me standing near the back. Raised his glass, squinted at my face. And said the words they'd never said, not even once. "Wait, you're the senator?" "Yes. I am. I'm Camille Hill. I'm 34 years old. And this is the part of the story they never thought I'd live to tell. They always said honor runs in our blood. 3 generations of Hill men in uniform, U.S. Marine Corps, Navy, Army, each with medals, scars, and framed flags folded with precision. We didn't just salute the flag. We served it, carried it, bled under it. In the Hill household, discipline wasn't optional. It was the air we breathed. My father, Colonel Robert Hill, spent 31 years in the Marines. Retired with a Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and a rigid spine no one dared question. He believed in rules the way others believed in God. That right and wrong were binary. That you never questioned command. That loyalty meant obedience, especially in public. My mother, Evelyn, was an Army nurse. She stitched wounds with trembling hands in field hospitals across Fallujah and Kandahar, then came home to bake pies like none of that happened. She taught us that silence, not screaming, was the stronger form of survival. And she never tolerated excuses. My little brother, Logan, followed the script perfectly. Army ROTC, Ranger School, 3 tours, and now a defense advisor to Governor Calder Jacobs. If you searched model son in my family's dictionary, Logan's picture would smile back at you, clean cut, in uniform, always respectful. And then there was me. I didn't rebel. That word never sat right. I studied political science at William and Mary because Dad said it was the closest thing to law without selling out. I joined the Office of National Security because Logan said I had the brain for classified work. I built policy frameworks, reviewed foreign contractor vetting procedures, wrote procedural ethics manuals so tight they made generals nervous. But it was never enough. Every holiday dinner turned into a panel review. Dad would grill me like I was a recruit under inspection. "You're pushing boundaries again, Camille." "No, sir. I'm identifying weaknesses in the system before others exploit them. That's not our job." "Then whose job is it?" Evelyn never took sides, but her silence was rarely neutral. She'd stir her tea and cut into ham while letting his words hang, letting mine wither. I still remember the first time Dad handed Logan his uniform plaque. Oak wood, golden seal, engraved with, "For service. For sacrifice. For honor." Logan turned to me and said, "You'll get yours too, one day. If you stay in line." I laughed. I think that's what did it. That quiet laugh, low and bitter, like I already knew the truth. Because even when I tried to walk the line, they never saw me walking it. They saw the possibility that I might, someday, refuse to. And that fear? That's what made them fold their arms around Logan and keep me at a distance. No one ever said it directly. They didn't have to. The message was in the way Dad didn't ask about my deployments, only about what I said on record. In how Mom hung Logan's army photo above the fireplace, while mine, press conference at the Capitol, dressed in a navy suit, sat in a hallway, barely dusted. In their world, service wasn't just action. It was compliance. And anything else, even if rooted in truth, smelled too much like dissent. But what they never realized was that my loyalty ran deeper than theirs. I didn't question orders because I was reckless. I questioned them because I believed people's lives depended on better ones. And in their eyes, that wasn't courage. That was betrayal. It started with a field memo. A single flagged line in a quarterly vendor audit I was overseeing for the Office of National Security. A name I didn't recognize, Forgewell Defense Logistics, appeared on a new supplier list for overseas troop medical kits. At first, it was just a discrepancy. A price hike that didn't match market norms. Then came duplicate invoices. Then ghost shipments. And then I saw the casualty reports, 3 Marines dead from infection in Kandahar after receiving expired trauma packs. I requested internal review. Silence. I resubmitted with red flags. Still nothing. Eventually, I pulled procurement footage. Warehouse clips showed crates being repacked, labels swapped. The new contractor, Forgewell, wasn't just cutting corners, they were laundering faulty surplus as government standard issue. I walked into my superior's office, Director Barnes, file in hand, every timestamp, every policy violation color-coded. "This is criminal negligence," I said. He didn't even look up from his desk. "Camille, you don't get to call it criminal. You get to submit your findings and let the system work." "What system?" "The one that's turning a blind eye because the contract was fast-tracked through Logan's recommendation letter?" That was the moment I felt the shift, not just in the room, but in the air around my name. By the end of that week, my security clearance was frozen, pending internal audit. My badge access was revoked. I was escorted out of the building under the pretense of a systems update. 2 days later, someone leaked a story to a defense blog accusing me of falsifying procurement records to undermine a sitting official. My name was never printed, but the article described a disgruntled mid-level female staffer with a personal vendetta and family ties in military politics. Logan never called. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. And then came the dinner. Evelyn texted me, just one line, "Family dinner. Dad's birthday. Don't make it about you." I went anyway. Sat 2 seats down from Logan at the table. He talked about the governor's upcoming Veterans Housing Initiative like I hadn't just been smeared in front of the entire defense community. Dad passed the mashed potatoes like I wasn't radioactive. When I finally tried to speak, Evelyn cut in without even looking up. "We agreed not to bring that mess into the house. It's handled now." Handled. Handled meant buried. Discredited. Forgotten. Sacrificed, quietly, for the greater good, so the family name stayed clean, so the mission kept marching. Later that night, I stood in the garage, where Dad still kept his Marine dress blues sealed in a garment bag. I looked at that uniform and wondered, how many lives had that man saved? How many had I just failed to protect? All because I thought telling the truth would matter. The next morning, I received an email from Internal Affairs. My position had been suspended indefinitely. My final paycheck would be mailed. Benefits terminated. No exit interview. Just a clean cut. A week later, a news outlet ran a segment titled "Security Breach Raises Questions About Internal Sabotage." A blurred photo of me walking out of headquarters, file in hand, played behind the reporter's voice. She was a rising star. But rising too fast, some say. I didn't reply. I didn't speak. I didn't sleep. I packed a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes, my birth certificate, and the one thing they hadn't taken, my old campaign memo pad, still stamped with Senator Hill, from a mock run I never got to finish. And I drove. No GPS. No destination. Just roads and silence. Because when the system punishes you for protecting the people it claims to serve, that's not justice. That's betrayal. I didn't stop driving until the interstate signs started dropping vowels. Until the roads narrowed and the gas stations turned into rusted-out sheds with bad coffee and broken soda machines. Until I found a place where nobody would know the name Camille Hill, and more importantly, nobody would care. Helena, Montana. That's where the bus let me off, long after my car died halfway through Wyoming and I'd used my last $20 on a refill and a vending machine sandwich. The sky was wide out here, so wide it made you feel smaller than you already were. That was a comfort, oddly. I didn't want to be seen anymore. I wanted to disappear into silence. I checked into a weekly rental motel under the name Ray Collins, Ray from my middle name, Collins from the back of a cereal box ad taped to the gas station window. The clerk didn't ask questions. Just handed me the key and a look that said, "I've seen worse." The motel smelled like bleach and mildew. The curtains didn't close right. The shower screamed every time I turned it on. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was nobody else's. I found work 3 days later at a small community library that doubled as an outreach center for local veterans. The director, a woman named Marla, didn't ask much, just if I could type fast and knew the Dewey Decimal System. I lied. She hired me anyway. Days passed. Then weeks. Then a month. I kept my head down. Showed up early. Stayed late. Took my coffee black and spoke only when spoken to. I stopped checking the news. Stopped checking my email. I left my old phone in a trash can behind a grocery store and bought a prepaid one with just enough minutes for emergency calls I never made. At night, I wrote. Not stories. Not reports. But policies. Anonymous revisions to legislation proposed in state houses across the country. Things I found buried in PDFs or buried deeper in forums and message boards. I rewrote weak veterans' housing bills. I buried loopholes in workforce funding. I ghost-authored grant applications under the alias CH and sent them to small nonprofits through a Dropbox no one could trace. It wasn't power. But it was precision. Quiet influence. Influence that mattered. I kept one thing with me, folded, faded, nearly unreadable. The mock campaign sticker from my almost run, Senator Hill, integrity isn't optional. I kept it taped inside a spiral notebook I used to sketch out legal structure revisions, not because I believed I'd ever wear that title, but because I needed to remember why I once did. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating through my shirt, convinced someone had found me. That a knock on the door would come. That Logan had tracked me down. Or worse, that my father had sent someone. But no one came. The most anyone ever asked was a kid at the library, maybe 12, who was learning how to write a persuasive essay. He looked up at me and asked, "Were you a teacher before?" I paused. Then nodded. Yes. Something like that. He smiled and went back to writing. That smile stuck with me. Because for the first time in months, someone wasn't asking what I had done. They were asking what I could still be. And that, right there, was the first piece of me that felt alive again. It was the smell that drew me in first, maple glazed bacon, butter sizzling on a flat top, fresh coffee thick in the air like something solid you could lean on. The diner sat across the street from the library, tucked between an old hardware store and a defunct barber shop with a paper, for lease, sign curling in the window. I passed it every day but never went in. It felt too warm, too familiar, too exposed. But that morning, I hadn't slept. I'd been up until nearly 4, combing through a policy draft buried deep in a state finance bill. Someone had slipped in a clause that would get housing support for honorably discharged veterans with mental health records. I rewrote it, sharpened it, buried protections in the sublanguage, then sent it off under CH, as always. By the time I walked to work, my stomach ached from caffeine and nothing else. So I pushed the door open. The bell above the frame jingled, soft and almost apologetic. The place smelled like someone still believed in Sunday mornings. Behind the counter stood a man in a faded gray Henley, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. His hair was dark and unruly, his beard neatly trimmed. He was working the griddle like he was conducting an orchestra. He didn't glance up right away, but when he did, it was like he registered me without judgment, just quiet recognition, the kind reserved for people who've seen too much and don't speak unless they mean it. "You want a booth or counter?" he asked. "Counter's fine," I replied, voice lower than I intended. He poured coffee without asking and slid over a menu. "Kitchen's behind." "What you order, I cook." "What I cook, I stand by." I wasn't sure if it was a motto or a warning, but it made me smile anyway. He nodded toward the black notebook I carried. "You a writer?" "Not really," I said, hesitating. I fix things other people break." He raised an eyebrow, flipped a pancake. "That sounds like something a writer would say." His name was Julian Reyes. The diner was his, bought cheap with his military pension and renovated with his own 2 hands after his second tour in Fallujah. He'd been a field medic, lost 2 fingers in an IED blast, then came back stateside to raise 2 daughters after his wife died of lymphoma. I didn't ask for all of that. He just told me. Not like a confession. Just a truth too tired to hide anymore. I started going back. Not every day. But more than I meant to. Sometimes I ordered toast just to sit in the hum of his presence. He always remembered how I liked it, burnt edges, extra butter, no jam. He never pried. Never asked why I always sat facing the door or why I flinched when someone new walked in. He just poured the coffee, refilled the water, and said things like, "Storms don't mean the roof's weak. Just means it's standing in the right place." One night, I stayed too late at the library after a class ran long. It started to snow, wet and mean. I found Julian waiting outside in his truck, engine running, windows fogged. "You walking home in this?" he asked. I didn't answer. "Come on. Truck's warm." I hesitated, hand tight on my notebook. Then I got in. He didn't ask where I lived. Just drove slow, radio low, letting silence settle like something sacred. Before I stepped out, he looked over and asked the simplest question anyone had asked me in months. "You eaten?" I shook my head. He handed me a brown paper bag, warm and folded tight. "Stew's still hot. You can return the bowl tomorrow." That was it. No curiosity. No digging. Just kindness without conditions. And after everything I'd lost, it felt like grace. I always knew this life had an expiration date. You can disappear, yes, but only for so long. Eventually, someone always starts asking the wrong questions in the right rooms. And when that someone is Natalie Cross, there's no grace period. Just crosshairs. We'd served together once, back when I was still Camille Hill and she was still trying to outwork the shadows of the men who doubted her. She was sharp, viciously competent, and always 3 steps ahead of every decision. We respected each other. Fought together in policy war rooms. Pulled all-nighters drafting compliance language that protected whistleblowers, not punished them. Or so I thought. I hadn't seen her since the hearings. She didn't testify, didn't call. She just vanished into the machine, only to reappear as Governor Calder Jacobs' chief communications strategist 2 years later. I didn't know that part until Logan let my name slip in a closed-door press briefing. According to a journalist I trusted, barely, Governor Jacobs had asked about military family backgrounds on staff for a profile piece. Logan had mentioned his sister casually, like I was an interesting footnote instead of a loaded mine. He said I'd once worked for national security. Said I was a brilliant mind who chose to disappear. He probably meant it as a compliment. But Natalie knew better. She'd been in the room. She knew my phrasing. My cadence. My style. She had read the same anonymous policy briefs ghost-authored by CH that had been circulating across independent reform circles. She connected the dots the way only someone close ever could. And then the digging began. I first felt the shift when my inbox flooded with strange requests. Vague inquiries from think tanks I'd never heard of, asking if I offered consulting. Someone tried to confirm my address through a third-party database. Then a local reporter reached out, asking if I was familiar with a series of anonymous op-eds submitted under the name Liberty Ray. I never used that name. But the style? It was close enough to set off alarms. Then came the email from a nonprofit director in Des Moines, someone I'd quietly helped rewrite a re-entry bill for ex-military convicts. Heads up, it read. One of the governor's media aides is calling around, asking questions about your team. They're not saying your name, but be careful. My stomach sank. That night, I stayed late at the library. Everyone else had gone home. I turned off the lights, closed the door to the break room, and pulled out my notebook, the one where I kept a running log of every anonymous brief I'd ever sent, every hidden hand I'd lent. I stared at it for an hour. Then I tore out 10 pages and burned them behind the building in a tin trash can. The flame was too slow. My hands shook. The next morning, someone spray-painted the word liar across the front windows of the library. Below it, in sloppier red paint, traitor in heels. Marla didn't ask if it was about me. She just quietly started wiping it off with vinegar and a rag while I stood beside her in silence. Julian showed up an hour later with coffee and didn't say anything either. But the way he looked at me, like he knew I was about to vanish again, made something crack inside. I'd spent over a year building a life here. Quiet. Anonymous. Useful. And now Natalie was dismantling it with surgical precision. She wasn't after justice. She was after a story, one she could twist, weaponize, bury me with. And the worst part? She knew exactly where to start cutting. There's a moment, right before resolve hardens, when silence feels like a prison. When you realize that disappearing doesn't make you safe. It just makes you easier to erase. That was the morning I stopped hiding. I stood in front of the cracked mirror in my studio apartment, the one above the old hardware shop that still smelled like dust and pipe grease. I looked at myself for a long time. Not Ray Collins. Not the librarian. Not the ghost who fixed other people's mistakes behind layers of digital anonymity. Camille Hill. That name still lived in my chest. Bruised, yes, but never broken. I pulled the shoebox from beneath the floorboard. Inside it, still folded in a Ziploc, was the last thing I'd taken from D.C., my old mock campaign badge, Senator Hill, integrity isn't optional. I peeled it out, wiped the edges with my sleeve, and pinned it to the inside of my coat pocket. Not to be seen. But to remember who I used to be before they made me feel ashamed of it. I made 2 calls that day. One to a contact from my old whistleblower case, an independent legal analyst named Tess Monroe, who now worked with a coalition of government watchdogs. And the other to a woman I'd once ghostwrote a bill for, Clara Cho, a relentless state senator from Oregon who owed me no favors, but always remembered what I'd done for her when no one else would touch her housing reform draft. They both picked up on the first ring. Tess didn't ask how I was. She just said, "We've been waiting for you to come back." By nightfall, we had a meeting set with a network of independent investigative journalists who specialized in media manipulation and political retaliation. Natalie's fingerprints weren't just on my case. Tess had been building a file, quietly, methodically, for over a year, connecting Natalie's media firm to a string of anonymous leaks, character takedowns, and coordinated smear campaigns, all designed to silence reformers and discredit policy dissenters. And now, she had a face to go with the data. Mine. We assembled every thread, my anonymous policy rewrites, my ghost-signed briefs, the vandalism at the library, the unusual digital footprints on Natalie's side, all of it cross-checked, time-stamped, triangulated with public records. We didn't just build a defense. We built a case. Clara pulled strings to get me a spot at Governor Calder Jacobs' Veterans Policy Gala. Not as a guest of honor. Not even under my own name. Just a line in the attendee list, Community Advocate, CH. They didn't know I'd be stepping into the room. They didn't expect me to show up at all. I wore black that night, simple, structured, sharp. The kind of black that didn't beg for forgiveness. The kind of black you wore to bury something that once tried to bury you. As I approached the venue, I saw my brother Logan standing at the front, checking IDs with a practiced military calm. He didn't recognize me at first. Then his eyes caught mine, and something shifted. Not guilt. Not relief. Fear. I didn't flinch. Inside, the room buzzed with polished suits and campaign smiles. Natalie stood near the dais, whispering into the governor's ear. She looked smug. Secure. Untouchable. She hadn't seen me yet. I moved to the side entrance where the press team was prepping materials. I handed them a sealed packet, documents, emails, statements, every piece of proof Tess and I had compiled. I watched as a reporter's eyes widened, scanning the files, mouth slightly open. It's time, I said, voice even. But not for me. For the truth. And then I turned, stepped into the crowd, and waited for the reckoning to begin. Because if they were going to call me a traitor, they'd learn what loyalty really looked like. The ballroom lights were blinding. Gilded chandeliers swung slightly from the antique ceiling beams, polished too bright for a room that hid so much rot. The hum of expensive suits, rehearsed laughter, and carefully veiled ambition filled the air like static. I stood near the side wall, anonymous in black, jaw set, breath even. My badge simply read, CH, Community Advocate. They still didn't know. Not yet. Natalie cross-paced near the podium, clipboard tucked beneath her arm, every hair in place, every word likely rehearsed a dozen times. Logan stood to the right of the stage, flanked by 2 other aides. He looked calm, controlled. But his eyes scanned the room like he sensed a breach coming and couldn't name it. Governor Calder Jacobs stepped up to the mic. The room hushed. He opened with the usual lines, service, sacrifice, strength of our nation. All the words people in this room had said so many times they no longer felt them. Then he gestured toward Natalie. Tonight's policy briefing will be delivered by our chief strategist, a woman who's helped craft one of the boldest veteran service reforms this state has ever seen. Polite applause. Natalie took the mic. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. As many of you know, she began, we've been quietly working behind the scenes on a comprehensive strategy to redirect resources toward modern veterans' needs, mental health, employment access, transitional housing. And tonight, I'm proud to unveil. That's when the projection screen behind her flickered. The press team shifted. A hush swept the room. On screen appeared a scanned document, marked with the governor's seal, but with highlighted sections. My sections. The original draft of the bill, line for line, identical to what I'd anonymously submitted to Clara Cho's office a year ago. Language too precise to be coincidence. Data tables formatted the exact same way I'd used in every brief. And in the corner, just beneath the title, sat a line I'd stopped using when I disappeared. Prepared by C. Hill, for internal review only. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Natalie turned, stiff, blinking hard, then spun toward the tech booth. Too late. More documents appeared, emails showing her editing the drafts, stripping author names, submitting them as Governor Strategic Materials. I stepped forward before security could move. My name is Camille Hill, I said, loud enough to bounce against the chandelier glass. All heads turned. Even Logan. I wrote those policies. I ghosted them to protect their legitimacy, because people like Natalie would have buried them if they had my name on them. I didn't disappear because I was guilty. I disappeared because I told the truth, and the system punished me for it. Natalie's voice cut in, sharp and panicked. She was under investigation. She manipulated. I raised a hand. No. I was under investigation because I exposed a defense contractor putting expired medical kits in combat zones. 3 Marines died. I filed the report. I followed protocol. And your people buried it. I turned to the governor. You want to talk about betrayal? Let's be clear, I didn't betray the uniform. I wore it in my way. I protected the people who wore it for real. You betrayed them. Every time you let politics matter more than policy. Every time you looked the other way while someone cashed in on a veteran's pain. The silence afterward was the loudest moment of my life. The press surged forward. Flashbulbs. Murmurs. A reporter shouted, "Is this true, Governor?" Another called to Logan, "Did you know your sister was the original author?" Logan froze. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, not to defend me. Not to deny. But to speak into the microphone. She told the truth, he said. Voice quiet, but clear. And I was too much of a coward to back her when it mattered. Natalie stared at him like he'd betrayed her. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. Governor Jacobs finally spoke. We'll be reviewing these materials and launching a formal ethics inquiry. Effective immediately, Ms. Cross is on administrative leave. Natalie dropped the clipboard. It hit the stage with a hollow echo. I didn't stay for the rest. I walked past the flashbulbs, past the muttering suits and glassy stares, past Logan, who gave me a nod, small but honest. Out into the cold, under the quiet stars, I finally exhaled. For the first time in years. I was visible. They didn't arrest Natalie Cross. Not right away. That kind of justice takes time. But her resignation came quietly, buried in the Friday night news cycle, wrapped in a bland statement about personal focus and family. Governor Calder Jacobs's office launched an internal ethics review, and several senior staff were reassigned within weeks. Logan stepped away from his post too. No press conference. Just a quiet departure and a letter that simply said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to remember what you stood for." I didn't respond. Not then. Instead, I went back to Helena. The library windows had been cleaned. The red spray paint scrubbed off, though a faint trace still lingered on the brick if you knew where to look. Marla handed me my old keys like I'd never left. Julian left a bowl of stew in my fridge with a sticky note, "Still hot. Still here." That was his way of saying, "You're safe." I reopened the notebook. Not the one I'd burned through. A new one. Clean pages. Clear purpose. I reached out to Tess Monroe and Clara Cho. We started drafting again, this time under my real name. Proposals for independent oversight committees on veteran services. Protections for whistleblowers inside the DoD. Reform blueprints not to win votes, but to fix damage that had already been done. We called it the Silent Watch Foundation. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a political stunt. It was a blueprint for survival, for every soldier, policy writer, and truth teller who'd been silenced for daring to care more about people than optics. A few weeks later, I spoke at a town hall, not a gala, not a press event. Just a fold-out chair in a rec center gym, a microphone that squeaked too much, and a room full of veterans who looked more tired than angry. One woman stood up, hands shaking, and said, "I called out misconduct on my base. I lost my housing, my benefits, everything. And I was made to feel like I was the one who failed." I looked her in the eye and said, "You didn't fail. You fought a war that never made the headlines. And you're still standing." She cried. Quietly. No drama. Just relief. Afterward, as I packed up my files, someone asked if I planned to run for office again. I smiled. No. I don't need a uniform, or a title, to keep fighting. I stepped outside, into air that finally felt like mine again. I wasn't Camille Hill, the disgrace. I wasn't Ray Collins, the ghost. I was simply Camille. And that, at last, was enough.